The scary voice. You can always tell when a talk is either at the end of the day or the start of term, because it's the only time that people are quiet before a talk rather than really loud. All right, I'm going to get started. So thank you all for coming to my talk today. It is entitled, as the slide in the advert said, Going Native and Compiling Code, Exploring Gender Equality in Programming Cultures. So I am Dr. Siân Brooke, and I'm a fellow in computational social science at the London School of Economics. I am here visiting the Hertie School Data Science Lab as part of the Civica postdoctoral mobility scheme, which means I've been here for 3 months working on some of the research projects that I will talk about today. In general, my work focuses on gender and inequality in technical communities. So this is communities that also talk using computers, like internet culture, slang, that sort of thing as well. And my work is generally quite interdisciplinary, or as one of my lovely MSCs called me, undisciplined. And it emphasizes practical outputs as well as real world activism in research. So my talk today is not really going to focus so much on the theory or substantive findings of my research, but will be more oriented towards what are interesting ways that you can study research design? How can you approach sort of the social sciences and the internet together? My general topic of interest, as I said, is gender inequality, but a lot of these methods and approaches, because I teach generally research design and programming, can be maneuvered to look at other subjects as well. But if you are interested in the specifics of my findings, then I keep my website quite up to date with everything that I am doing. And I also use Twitter to shout about it all the time. So throughout today, when I'm talking about research design, I will use my work as examples. And this is because I think it's really rare that we get the chance to actually have a conversation with researchers or really engage with like their design process rather than just this beautifully polished end result that then looks incredibly intimidating and all the mistakes and the processes along the way. But in general, I want to like really rally home that I'm not saying that my work is like a gold standard or the way to do it. I'm saying that it is one of the approaches. And the idea today, you'll see I operationalize things in different ways at different times. And that is to show that there are multiple options that we can consider when we go, okay, I'm going to study something like democracy, right? Or equality, or even just like people. And then it's like, okay, well, what do I mean within this context? So the objective of the talk today is to really think about how we study a phenomenon, the different ways that we can use data science to do so, but also focusing on studying gender equity online and in technical communities as a like a case study for the different ways that we can do this. So in describing, in describing my talk today, I talked about rehabilitating data science into social sciences. And what I mean by this is we bring like some of the critical thinking, some of the questioning back into data science, this sort of exploratory approach that's really in open source, rather than just going, okay, what information does an API have available? What in that information do I want to use to predict something else, right? So it's like, how can we process information? How can we think about it in the way that we experience it as people, because it's social science, rather than it just being what data is out there. So this is what I mean by rehabilitation. So in my talk today, I'm going to focus on 3 themes to do with studying gender in online communities. And these will be used as different ways to approach research design. So first I look at gender. And so that is, how do we turn a lived experience into a measurable variable? Second, intersectionality, like how do you approach more like complex identity politics and measuring that within research design? And then thirdly is thinking about like sexism. Okay, so what does it mean when we think about prejudice? Is prejudice just difference? Is it just a 2-sample t-test and we go, well, that group is significantly different to that group, so that's automatically prejudiced? It's thinking about these things within a social context. I will use 3 of my projects in order to contextualize these points on research design, and I will sort of jump in and out of them at various points and discussing like very specific elements, but in general, they are all looking at women and people involved in technical communities and learning to code. So first, as all good papers should start out with, you should define your terms. And so one of the things that often gets quite unspoken where social science and data science meet is the difference between sex and gender. So a large focus of my research is on language. And if we're doing any sort of natural language processing or working with textual data, we need to really think about the words that we use. And only by really actively engaging with the assumptions that different words have in them can we really move forward and have this convincing operationalization, right? If we're talking about operationalization, how we make a concept measurable, then we need to first define the concept. And so here, I think it's useful to engage with the idea that we often treat it as there's a biological sex as a layer, and then there's the social construction of gender that we put on top. In my work, I really problematize this sort of binary definition. There is a lot of work, and I'm working on a bibliography that essentially shows that there's more variation within sex groupings than between. So the difference is not statistically significant. However, in terms of when we're talking about this, because we're talking about interactions and the social sciences and inequality, the correct terminology is gender and woman, because we're talking about discrimination as socially imposed, and we are completely seeing biological sex as irrelevant. It's about social differences and how they are expressed within people talking to each other. The notion of biology in general is not particularly useful here. So one of the issues when talking about gender and what we think about gender in terms of discrimination that often pops up in my work, because I look at women in programming, is that it's not a matter of stereotyping. I don't think all people who work with computers are men. I'm just making a statistical guess, right? It's Bayesian rationality. You can go, well, 90% of the people I know who work with computer are men, so therefore I will guess that everyone is a man all of the time. And it's really looking at, okay, well, what assumptions do we have as a researcher in this field? How does this impact my research site? And also, where is this sort of breakdown in the experience? So one of the first studies I'll talk about of mine is on the question and answer programming forum Stack Overflow. And Stack Overflow says that only 8% of its users are women. But that just completely doesn't track. How can the largest programming community only be 8% women when 18% of computer science graduates are women, when you have biologists who write code who are women, when you have social scientists who write code who are women? Like, this number doesn't really work. So that's the statistic. So where are they? And it was this idea that women might use anonymous pseudonyms, like, say, Spaghetti Monster, in order to participate in technical forums. They might mask their identity. And I think a lot of this research on gender stereotypes, women in programming, and discrimination can kind of avoid this idea that women have a agency in deciding not to experience sexism, that there's a choice there that's made, and that people aren't just like a singular data point. So yes, statistics are useful in informing the direction we look in. Like, it was interesting to me that 90% of this website was apparently men, but they can be illustrative. They don't necessarily have to completely dominate or treat it as like a base truth for when we're working out how gender works there, because it can close us off quite quickly. Right, now let's move on to the more meat of the talk. So one of the things that I am working on at the moment is I am contributing a chapter to a computational social science methods book. And me and my co-author Orsi are working on, okay, well, what if we were to write a textbook that tells you how to do data science to study gender? What do we want students to know? And part of the premise of this is that we don't just say, this is the way to do it, this is the way that you study gender, but we instead show that there is a broad spectrum of ways that you can approach this. And through having this sort of wider understanding of these are the different paradigms, another word, big theory, that you can then approach how you would study a concept. So as I said before, cultural relativism here, this theory by within gender performativity, that's a scholar called Judith Butler, is very well regarded in like feminist scholarship. But because it's about culturally relative, because it's about performance, because it's about a lot of nuances in how we act, it can often be quite difficult to think about computationally. Whereas something like the positivist perspective that we have here, that views sex as a binary, as a 0 and 1, is a lot easier to study computationally. It's a binary, right? It's the language of computers. And it also means that we can have a very simple model. If we're predicting gender from a positivist standpoint, we're just predicting 0 or 1, we can have a logistic regression. Whereas if we're how do you perform performativity? How do you put that into a model? How do you do it? And I think that this is one of the reasons that a lot of research gets more towards the positivist end, is because it's simple. It's built into how we do data science. It's a parsimonious approach to modeling. It's looking for simplicity. My understanding is that rather than putting complexity in how we build models, rather than having to use increasingly more complex models, we put the complexity in the operationalization. And we think about the levels and the forms of categories or scales that we are trying to predict. So one of the other tables that I put in this that aligns with this idea of going from a very positivist to a very post-structuralist perspective, words that are very common in critical social science, but less so in data science, is to try and provide like a practical map. This is one of those such diagrams that you might get, say, think about like a representation of a cell in a biology textbook, right? It's completely wrong, but it's quite useful in working out where everything is and how things could fit together. So here I am building on the structuralist idea of gender, because if we are not going to be able to do positivist, if we want to expand between two categories, a first step on that way might be to have multiple categories. And so Barbara Risman, a famous feminist scholar from the Chicago School, talks about gender operating on these 3 levels. There is the individual level, how you think about yourself, how you experience your own identity, how you decide to look, and how you think about, oh, okay, well, like, I'm not even going to think that I will go and sit that computer science course, right? It's like before it even gets to the point of talking to another person. There is then the interactional element, which is then say, maybe women are a bit more likely to take on a caregiver role, or maybe you're more likely to caveat what you're saying with, I believe, I can, rather than I will, right? And it's all of these different dynamics. And then you have a cultural level, which is then about, okay, well, women get paid less if they work in computer science, right? Like there's these three different levels. And I find this articulation of these levels to be quite useful, and it gives us a way to scope and to aim at the field of research. I then try and put different types of scholarship, focusing on like very high profile gender scholars, and their relative theories, going way back in from the 1970s, when we first sort of had this like hegemonic gender theory, and then right up to the 2010s when we're talking about applying Risman's theory. I then also try to align CSS's computational social science with these approaches. Some of them are more obvious than others. For example, interaction, social network analysis. How are 2 points, 2 users, 2 people related to each other? How do they talk to each other? We then have larger cultural methods, say maybe unsupervised, like clustering. What groups do people form based on how they speak to each other? If you were going to get everyone who works on a website and you were to say, okay, well, I want my unsupervised algorithm, which means we haven't given it any training data, we haven't given it any instructions, we've just said, group these people into 2 groups. Does that look like gender? Yes or no? Or is there some other hierarchy that's there? And because that's working on this larger level, that's where I put it in the cultural level. So the first thing to think about when studying social identity and being critical in this rehabilitation of data science is scope. Where am I looking at, and in what way? And is my method appropriate for that level of identity? And you can see here how gender can be in each theory. I think very much like data science in gender studies, it can be one of these topics where you look at it and there's so much gatekeeping, there's so much theory, there's so much assumptions of what you already need to know before you even start working on it. And that's why I think it's really useful to have something like this that almost gives you that little bit of a roadmap, that little way of sort of navigating, well, if I was to put this into different ways, where would it go? This is all available as a preprint, by the way, with the link at the bottom of the slides. Okay, so first, I'm going to give you a bit more practical deep dive into some of my own work. And so this is a study that emerged from my doctoral research at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I actually paired this computational work with a ethnography of hackathons. So it was like this really fun project that got to exist online and offline at the same time. Now, this paper examined gender biases on Stack Overflow, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's the world's largest question and answer forum, think Yahoo Answers, of programming knowledge. And so what I did here is I built a non-binary gender identification model that was built on just the usernames of people. And I investigated how, if the gender that was shown in that username, if that shaped people's experiences in a way that was statistically significant. My premise here was that whilst I can get more information on a user, when you're posting, all you actually really see is a username. You don't see all of the information that they put on their profile. You don't see their birth date. You don't see their location. You don't see any of the about me. It's how do I see the website? So being a little bit meta, this is a question that I posted about another project to do with getting a web app to work. And so much like Reddit or other forums, you can see that we have a title, we give a body of text. Stack Overflow is so strict on formatting it correctly. And then it gets upvoted and downvoted, and you accept like the popular answer. Like it's something that we're sort of quite familiar with on these sort of content generation websites. So Stack Overflow is generally known to be quite hostile. During my doctorate, I wrote a paper called Rude Condescending Assholes, Performances of Gender on Stack Overflow. And that was because those 3 words were the words most commonly used by women to describe how they felt about the culture. Whereas with men, it was algorithm, instructions, community, right? That's a very different construction of the same exact space and interacting with it in the same way. So in general, if you are currently or are going to take any technical courses, Stack Overflow will become your worst enemy and your best friend. It covers pretty much any topic to do with computing that you can think of, and it has little to no barriers to entry. It's like creating a Reddit account. You really don't have to provide anything that interesting. And it's just a way for other people to be able to give answers. However, it's quite often very hostile. We're not doing your homework for you, check the documentation, like lots of quite dismissive, condescending comments are quite frequently on there. And so these are sort of generally the questions that I asked when I'm looking at gender and how I think about it in this platform. And so I'm first looking at, because I wasn't quite sure in which direction it was going to go, like, because it would be, well, do women get more answers because of white knighting behavior? Or do they get less because they're seen as technologically incompetent? I didn't really know which way it was going to go. So that was why I articulated it as gender differences. And then I also referred to it as gender biases rather than sexism necessarily, because when I did my gender classification, I also included an anonymous group. So this was people that I couldn't label the gender of. And then I have, is interaction on Stack Overflow organized by gender? And this is a very clear hark back to some of the Risman, where she says interaction, that is the middle level. And I'm saying, well, it's structured, it's organized by gender. So here we have the table from the paper that then shows the different categories I used. And so this was essentially built out from the idea that whenever we're asking a computer to guess anything, we get given the percentage likelihood that the computer thinks that its guess is correct, right? So, and then anything over a certain threshold. So if we're 80% sure that someone can be labeled as a man, then we could say, okay, everyone above that threshold is a man. But then what happens to 79, right? Like it's quite an arbitrary barrier. So in my research, I decided to essentially get this spectrum, but group it into categories. So it's into 5 categories, which were masculine, mostly masculine, anonymous, feminine, and mostly feminine. And I use this language because I'm talking about if the username itself is labeled as masculine or feminine, I'm not really making an inference as to the gender of the person behind the account, because that's not really that interesting to me. What I'm interested in is when you're on this site, who do you see, right? Because you're not suddenly going to be like clicking through everyone's profile. You're not going to be like DMing someone to ask what their actual gender is, right? It's about, okay, if I'm in this space, what do I see? And that is like the lived experience of it. So that is where the social science, sociology side of it comes in. Because I'm looking at interaction, I then also do an element of social network analysis on this. And you can see that I have 55% of users as masculine, but when it comes to networked users, so these were users who talk to other users in my data set, the number of masculine goes up a bit, but it's around the same. But what is quite noticeable is that my numbers are very different to what is put forward by Stack Overflow. And this isn't because my numbers are wrong or their numbers are wrong, but it's because that we came to it in a very different way. They looked at self-reported gender, which is going to be very different because it's self-reported for people who decided to report, not people who are actually using the site, right? And they're very different metrics. But in general, after testing all of this labeling, it was over 95% accurate, which means I got some people to label the data and I saw if my algorithm agreed with them. And 95% of the time it did, which was satisfactory. So the point here is to think about it. Is there any room for including a little bit of messiness in this data? Because really this sort of messiness is more representative of how we experience the social world, how we experience platforms. There's a quote by the famous statistician George Box that says all models are wrong, but some are useful. So all models, we're reducing social phenomenon down to numbers, down to very specific variables, and down to the things that we're interested in. So when we're doing this process of reducing, we then have to think, okay, well, where can I allow a little bit of messiness? And often including an anonymous grouping like this can actually increase the precision of your model, because it gives the defining line between the two spaces a name in a way where it's just not like a weak version of that group. So it is really worth thinking about the different ways. Anything that you're studying, really taking that time on operationalization is really worth it, especially when it comes to anything you're writing, like linking it to what has been there before, thinking about what your findings actually mean. Because if you've operationalized something badly or incompletely, then it's going to be really hard to do anything with that research. So it's like, okay, well, where can I go with it? And it's also the bit of the research that you tend to have more time for as well. Okay, so I also want to go over intersectionality. And this is something that a lot of data scientists don't touch with a 10-foot barge pole, because it's difficult for the reason, essentially because you just need more data points. If you're going to do any modeling with any data and you have a interaction effect, say the difference between like gender and ethnicity, you're going to need more data points because you're going to have to model that interaction, right? And so with a full factorial design, that can be the number of levels of each attribute time. So in the experiment that I will show you later, that would have meant that there was 810 possible combinations of my variable. And then if I have a sample of 2,000 people, everyone's only seeing each version twice, right? So that's not really enough to build anything from it. This is where it's important to think about what you're prioritizing in your data. When you say intersectionality, what do you mean? Do you mean just gender and ethnicity? Do you mean gender, ethnicity, and education? Do you mean nationality? Do you mean names or images that signal ethnicity? So it's very clear to think about the more precise that you are with what you're trying to measure, the better you'll be able to measure it. The other thing is, while it is messy and it is difficult, like studying intersectionality is incredibly valuable. And there's a wealth of opportunities, both in academia and in the private sector, of looking at like the ethics algorithms and like how these things are built and how discrimination is built into this. So it's not just like a bit of fluffy academia, like it's very, very practical. And especially in Berlin, there is a lot of work that is done on like bringing sort of intersectionality into algorithms. Cool. So again, because I like practical advice, the chapter of the book also adapts some work from Rushton, and she works on survey design. And so if you can't find anything in terms of computational research, it's always worth looking, okay, well, what's done in quantitative research? Because they're generally the same. You just use R rather than Python, right? Like they're really, really similar fields. And so a lot of distinctions there can be reasonably arbitrary. So Rushton provides these 4 frameworks along with this advice. And then I've sort of paraphrased them in a way that makes sense outside of survey design in the final column. And so this is to help you understand, okay, well, how would I want to look at this? How would I want to look at intersectionality? What are the ways that people have done it? Again, not a complete list. Please think about how you can do a better job than what is summed up in a very small table. But it's a way of going, not only is this possible, but you have options on how to do it. Now, to practice what I preach a little bit, I'm going to show you about how I tried to build some intercategorical research into an ongoing project I have. And then I'm also going to use this as a way of showing that doing research into gender and programming and this sort of stuff doesn't always just involve scraping, but it can involve doing other interesting things and ways of learning new skills. So one of the projects that I have ongoing at the moment is called Equity in Freelancing. It's supported mostly by the British Academy, and it's a project that looks into how much intersectional discrimination are there on freelancing websites. I call them online labor markets because I mean Upwork, Fiverr, people per hour, but also people who just like find stuff on Gumtree or Instagram, because I ask a bit about that at different points in the survey. But this is quite a large project, and it's looking at this notion of labor equity, of what bits do we show about people on a platform that matters, and ultimately are people like so racist or sexist that it doesn't matter how good someone is, they will still just always go for the one that they feel more I don't know, like is that their things likely to do a better job. And when doing this research, it was very important that we also did what was called peer researcher interviews. So this means that I sat down with people who were freelancers, who had experiences of working in online labor markets. And rather than just taking what published academia says about them, we did what is called like user experience research. So we asked them what would they like, what had they experienced? And that was really able to inform the project in a way, because it allowed us to expand beyond just, well, data science literature used Upwork API and found this. Whereas the freelancers actually they didn't want women only search options, because, and especially the women I spoke to, because they found that affirmative action would mean that they would get lower in their perspective. So it was like being able to balance these two ideas. So because this is a large project, I have just skipped to having the last two research questions I do, which, because I'm looking at intersectional discrimination, I build a like a mock freelancing platform, like a fake Upwork. And I get people to essentially choose between which two people they want, using a methodology that's used so much in marketing research, and then get them to like just change the attributes of each profile and see, okay, well, if we change someone's reputation points, or if we change the gender of a user, how does this impact the likelihood that a user will get hired? And so you can quantify the level of preference that is attached to each identity attribute, as well as the bits of the platform. So it allows us to see, okay, much in the same way you go, okay, if I change this car from red to blue, people are more likely to buy the blue car, but the car is exactly the same. So if you have two things that are exactly the same and you go, okay, man, woman, and then you go, okay, well, what percentage of people just choose man or woman? Like you isolate that sort of preference, essentially. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, I have pictures, so that also helps. So as I said, there's 3 sort of stages to this subject, to this study, and that's because I didn't want to do an experiment without actually speaking and getting the experiences of people into it. Like, I don't really like the idea of doing an experiment based purely on literature, but I wanted to include the experiences of people in them. And this meant that I did change quite a lot of what I was going to include in the research design. So not only did I want to see what are the baseline levels of discrimination, like how much is each of these attributes worth, but because just describing prejudice and describing discrimination is just generally a bit depressing, and I quite like my research to have recommendations, I also then decided to test interventions. So this idea, okay, well, in my earlier Stack Overflow project, it was maybe people use anonymity in order to be able to be on the platform more. And so I wanted to test these ideas that are theorized and just see, well, is that true? Because I'm sure whenever we've read papers or reports, they often end with, well, this should be done. And then it's silence, right? So I thought, well, okay, let's test them then. Let's have a look. And I initially had this really boring big table of all of the things that the literature suggested things can do. So there's really simple ones like, so Uber and Lyft use this where they only have very specific amounts of information, right, that you can get about a driver or something else. You know, their average stars, their picture, and maybe their name. There's very limited information. There's also the idea that people are nicer if you use real names than if it's anonymous, which I always think makes absolutely no sense, because have you ever been on Facebook? Like, everyone uses their names and people are mean. And there's so many different sort of ways that we could do this. However, so this is an idea of the structure of the experimental design, essentially. And so they would have a landing page, which I'll show you in a sec, but it generally looks like this. You then have the 7 trials, which was enough to be able to work out how much each of these features of freelance. So that gives me the baseline to test against. So it means that everything is kept within the same design. And then I have 5 interventions. So the ones that were from the literature do not have a box around them, which is community profiles. I look at all of these other people who have completed similar projects and seeing if you make them a similar identity to one of the freelancers, does that change? Are people more likely to pick someone that they think has been successful if other people look similar to them? Text reviews, so no numbers, only just loads of text saying how amazing a person is. And then a discrimination prompt. And I put that at the end because I didn't want priming. I didn't want people to be prompted to think about discrimination earlier on and then change how they dealt with all of the other things. That has to be last. The other 2 came from the interviews. So the first is something I've called inclusivity flares, and you may have seen these on like Google Maps or whatever, but it's like where it goes women-owned business, right? POC-owned business, LGBT-friendly, right? Like something like that. And I did, let's test them. Let's see if we put that on a profile. Does it reduce the discrimination, or does it like swing it towards people buying it, like however you want to conceive of it? And the other thing that loads of the freelancers mentioned was a union. They would really like a way of having people like vetted to be up to a particular standard, and also to have options to report people to the union and report jobs to the union. So just the very idea that there is some form of like formalized oversight, they thought would like vastly change it. And so I also wanted to build that in the design because it was something that was not in the literature at all, but was almost ubiquitously mentioned in the interviews. Okay, so this is the app that I was trying to get to work when I posted that question on Stack Overflow. And essentially it looks a little bit like Upwork. It's done to look like colors. It's made to look reasonably professional. I posted it on Amazon Mechanical Turk with the idea that freelancers were testing this website, right? So it has a little idea that, okay, you can go through and you can comment on what features that you like, but they're not actively prompted for discrimination. So it has pop-up boxes, it tells people what to do, and it tells people that they will be, it essentially gets people to think about their decision, right? It tells you results will be monitored in real time. They will not, right? It just shows people, just goes, think a little bit. I also asked people after each time they make a decision to rate how confident that they are, and that's like an attention check, right? So it's like, how do you subtly build these things in? Because if you don't want to go to someone, I'm going to test how sexist you are. What do you think about women, right? Because that's going to completely change their answer. So this is why you have this sort of like way around how we think about it. I made job descriptions that I sort of got from Upwork or Freelancer, and then people would essentially choose which freelancer to hire. This is it was really, really bare bones. There's the default one for just like how much discrimination is there. Really creepily, these faces are generated by an AI. They're from aigenerate.com or something, some really explanatory URL like that. And so we scraped them because then they have the metadata of these identity categories in them. And then we can then use this to generate it. And this was quite an important ethical point, because when I was speaking to my co-authors, I was completely unwilling to use real people's faces in a test about discrimination. So using AI generated images sort of helped us with this idea. Another co-author suggested that we could use I forgot what it's called, machine vision, essentially, to infer people's race in photos if we didn't have enough of that sample group. No, don't use, there's some things that we just shouldn't use algorithms for, and inferring race from photos is very high up that list. The point is that the skills that are listed by each person are match up to the job description, they're just in a different order. So sometimes people, I want them to be able to justify some of their decisions, being like, oh, they weren't as skilled. And you're like, well, they're all exactly as skilled, right? So these are all things that are held constant. And another thing that emerged from it actually as well, in terms of intersectional discrimination, was the difference between native and fluent English. When hiring people to do with intersectional discrimination, they had a very strong preference for native over fluent English speakers. And I can very happily say, as a native English speaker in Berlin, that fluent English speakers are a lot better than us. But there is like this, it's almost like a latent discrimination. It's a way of inferring like Western whiteness, right? By saying native English. This is also an example of how I put the flares in. They were just super visible in the center, and then everything else sort of changes and it goes, okay, well, does this as an interaction term on this choice make a difference? Okay, cool. That was probably the longer one to explain. And so this one should not take as long. So there I was very clear in how I spoke about discrimination, right? It's anything that is anything else than equally likely to pick two profiles that are exactly the same on all other attributes, right? And it's okay if I change the gender, if I change the ethnicity, does that decision, the likelihood of that decision shift? And that's what I qualify discrimination as. And then the simplicity there is in the fact that it's ultimately a linear regression. It's lots of variables, but with different levels, and you're predicting higher or not higher, right? So it seems complex, but the model behind it is actually quite simple. In terms of sexism, I just put a definition up here because I generally think definitions are useful to have whenever you say about anything. And so one of the points here that I mentioned at the start was the idea that prejudice is different to difference, right? Like there has to be a theoretically motivated reason why that difference is sexism or racism or whatever. It can't just be difference, because that's when we really run into trouble with a lot of the positivist, potentially prejudicial assumptions, right? Like, so say if we say women aren't in programming because they're naturally not as good, then that's when we have a bit of a problem, right? This is where we really need to qualify when something is sexist. That perception is sexist. It's not like, I'm struggling for words to say it, but we generally need to be really, really careful about when we think difference and prejudice are and what the dividing line is. So one of the things that I did in my Stack Overflow research, returning to the first paper that was part of my doctorate, because I'm ultimately quite a petty person, is I decided to operationalize efforts in how people put technical contributions on the site. So as I showed in the earlier slide, you ask a question and then you get an answer. And the question process is very guided. It tells you exactly what to put in it. It even suggests like similar questions, like you're very led. But in the answer, there's a lot less guidance. So what I wanted to do was operationalize answer efforts. Like, does it have these different textual features in it? Like, is there formatted fragments of code? Like the boxes in it, is it commented? Is it annotated? Is there a reasonable amount of formatted text? And then just see if there was a gender difference in the effort that was put in, and that was using the 5 categories that we saw earlier. And then also seeing how that related to the scores that these answers were given by the other people who saw them on the website. And I'm sure it's not a huge surprise, but women received so this is feminine and mostly feminine users. So any user that wasn't anonymous, mostly masculine or masculine, received lower scores for their answer, despite having what was registered as higher effort. Right. And so this is where stereotype comes in, because it's like, okay, well, I know this place is a bit hostile. It has a reputation for being sexist. This is the amount of effort I'm going to put in it. I might think about it a bit more. I put all of this in, and then someone just gives me a URL and they say, read the documentation. And it's just not very helpful, right? So this was about, okay, well, what does my lived experience as a computational researcher lead me to want to try and study, right? Because that's ultimately something that's quite interesting when we're rehabilitating data science into social sciences. How do we see the world? How do we experience it? And I study the way that we experience that. I also looked at if you could use being condescended to predict someone's gender. So operationalizing condescension and sarcasm and just generally being rude to people, and then saying, okay, well, can you predictively use it as feminine based on people being rude to them? And yeah, and you can. I just didn't put that on the slide because the table is bigger. But it is all in the paper that's at the foot. Okay, so very quickly, because it's my last project and the one I've done least work on it so far, which is the project that I am doing here. And here I'm looking at gender differences in remote collaboration. So GitHub is a site that we all use. So this is a 3-year project, so it's a lot broader in scope. And so GitHub is the place where you keep your code, it's where you update it, but it's also where you show it and you collaborate and you work with others. So if you've ever been in a team where you use Dropbox or Google Drive, or like you send track changes and documents and forth, that is essentially what GitHub does. So this is some of my, frankly, quite shocking code for my freelancers project. And it has like deletions in red, additions in green, and it keeps this sort of rolling record of how people are working on code together in these distributed teams. I use it as a research site, and the project largely came from the fact that I also use it with my students in their computer programming class. It's how they submit all of their assignments and the different ways that they work through it as well. So it's such a, I think it was recently bought by Microsoft as well. Like it's such a key cornerstone of data science. But because it's the internet and because it's programming, people are sexist on it a lot. And so I have these two notions that have always been really interesting to me. The first question is just simply, do men and women write code differently? Like, do they? Like, it's such an assumption. It's such a common idea. So let's test it. And I did that based on just style. Do they adhere to a set of guidelines correctly? So with programming, like with grammar, there's an idea of sentence structure that we must have. There's an idea of how we might capitalize something or put brackets in or put new lines in, the same way that we do with any text. And so I say, okay, well, is there a general trend between men and women and how they do this differently? And I also then go back to putting agency in my respondents and go, okay, well, when people like experience like a sexism, they don't just do nothing, right? They're not just like a passive receptacle of a sexism, but people tend to respond. So I then, for the second part of the project, will essentially do like a natural experiment on GitHub. So this is using certain repos, using certain like ways that people are collaborating. If I detect a sexism, and then I have these different types of responses to it, which one of these types of responses means that this sexism is less likely to happen in the future? And so this gives like agency back to the people who work in these teams, thinking about how they deal with sexism and what works. And is it, for instance, something like, okay, well, a senior woman corrects them, doesn't do anything. Junior man corrects them, they're fine, right? Like they stop being sexist, like really unpicking these dynamics of it in more ways than one. So again, this is 2 studies because I'm unable to do one thing at a time. And it's first just this very simple yes or no question, and then it's this more exploratory, larger data science project where I also hope to build in some like an ethnography of open source communities and like how they enforce their codes of conduct and harassment policies like within organizations. So I always think there's a really fun site of research and thinking about gender and thinking about data science is like, where does offline and online meet? Like, where is that point? And that's when it's really easy to make the point that your research is interesting. I also just have some like flowcharts of how I'm generally going to do the research, but I think I have given that a briefest overview. So to return to the point that I made at the start, studying sexism is not merely about quantifying gender differences. It's not merely testing if these 2 populations are independent. It's thinking about, okay, well, what do we think gender is? What do we therefore think sexism is? And how does this look within the very specific context that I am studying? And hopefully some of those tables, my rambling and my example can sort of show you that there is a way to approach this. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now. But if you also don't feel like speaking up in a room or I don't catch it, then please feel free to email, tweet, or yeah, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. We'll have a lot of ammunition later to talk during the Hertie summer party for the chapter. I wanted to ask about your most recent project. What are your expectations as a researcher? Are there coding differences or differences in the coding style between genders as you will define them in this project? Where did the idea come from?
So the idea came from just this consistent, like there was this real discrepancy that I came across, which was like women aren't as good at programming, but if when they do code, their style is neater, it's more succinct, it follows the guidelines better. And there was just like this complete contradiction. And obviously like social sciences, you're like, oh, contradiction, excellent. And it just didn't really make sense. How can something be worse, but also better at the same time? And so then I wanted to like really delve deep into, well, why? Is it because people are, like my idea is because women are aware of the stereotypes, and this is often something that I find is missing in a lot of research about prejudice, is the fact that your respondents are actually aware of the prejudice and therefore act differently. Does that then mean that you're more likely, you're more self-conscious, you want to make sure that when you like share your code, it's up to a higher standard when it's published, right? That you're sort of overcompensating because you're aware of prejudices. And that's kind of what I thought. But then also there's differences between, well, okay, did you do this coding project on a full course, which is much more likely to be men because there's more men involved in computer science programs, or did you do it on your own in your room? So I want to specifically look at repos. So this is like your folder, your area on GitHub that have one collaborator. So this means I can make it's very easy to make the causal link that that person wrote that code. I then want to label non-binary gender. So I want to return to some form of at least masculine, anonymous, and feminine. And then I just want to see, okay, well, is there a difference in how they adhere to style guidelines? And then what are those differences? And I would like to do some of this for a clustering approach, which is where I like let all of my data points be drawn on it. And I go, okay, well, where are these groups? And then see if there is something in that group that then says, right, so is it actually about the way that people learn? But because women don't learn within formalized classrooms as much, this appears to be a gender difference. And it's just, I think it's one of these projects where it almost seems silly that no one's tried, Like the best that I found was a paper from like 2001, where two CS professors went to a conference. They had 15 snippets of code, and they asked other people at the conference to guess who had written the code and why. And so it's really under researched. I also am very careful to say that I'm looking at style and not quality, but with the idea that style is a facet of quality. And then it's also about, okay, so if this is how it looks on GitHub, this is how people are experiencing it, this is how people are coding, what is the stuff that we can do with that information that we can build into platforms, or we can, like when you have autocomplete in code, is it using all code that's written by men? Like there's lots of spaces in which the code that already exists really shifts who is learning it. So that was a bit of a messy answer, but it's a messy project currently.
After just one potential of a meter style, because there are so few women in code,
yeah,
only the good ones.
Survivorship bias.
Similar research was done for way long time ago in PhDs, where women PhDs were more intelligent because so few of them. So much.
So I think there would be remit for doing, what's it called? Simpson's paradox. Like, so say that is where you go, okay, well, let's get all of the repos, all of the ones that have followed the least or starred the least, and you compare like with like, and you then say, okay, well, we get these differences in gender, but then are they still like received as if they are like better or worse as well? And that gives you like another dimension to it.
I have a question. When I was learning Korean, I was laughed at a lot by Korean people, mainly because I speak very much like a Korean woman, mainly also because I was taught by female teachers. And, for some reason in Korean language, the way that female speakers and the way that male speakers choose words are quite different. So female choose words differently, and male choose words differently, and then that's very pronounced in the way that it's in the way the language is spoken. And so for this example, do you think that it has anything to do with the way that code are being taught is not different? It might be because the instructors, they teach code differently in different groups, in different schools, in different countries, that it might affect the way that people write code, not just because of their gender.
Yeah, like there's definitely different places that it can come from, but because it's a natural experiment, you're then sort of trying to work out, well, is this beyond the level of coincidence? Is this more than other noise? And you can, like, I will lightly break it down and not pick like formalized accounts, right? There'll be people's practice accounts. There'll be an element in the sampling procedure, and also say just like the duration that account has been active for. So say when I looked at Stack Overflow, I made sure that all of the accounts had posted more than a certain amount of questions and been active over a certain period of time. And when I was building the network, because I first wanted to look at something that's called like the glass cliff phenomenon, which means after a certain point, women just like drop off. And then but I still wanted to be able to look at who was successful. So I will probably try like looking at just say the about me, like if there's an institutional email address, just getting as much sort of information about users. So my general approach is to do it as like see if I can get a significant finding, see what there is from this larger interpretation of the data, and then once I have that in its bigger, simpler form, then sort of add complexity to it in terms of like diving down and adding nuances to where there might be more significant results. I definitely think it will change based on where people are, And also just because programming languages are generally in, say, English to start off with, which changes things. And if you learnt it for a statistics course versus like a web dev course, that will change things. And so a lot of it is going to be about looking at the readmes, about looking at sort of information that's on these profiles in order to compare like with like. But yeah, I'll just explore it when I get the data more.
For the distinction between male, mostly male, anonymous, and so on, did you try to do it with only like 3 categories as well, the only male, anonymous, and female, or like it's so good that make a difference?
So how I did it is I did 5 categories, and then at some points of comparison, when it made sense from the literature, I would group masculine and mostly masculine together. So it would then become, okay, well, is it like a masculine privilege? Is anyone who symbols masculinity preferred more than anonymous or femininity? And so it was where it made sense to like really have a look down into the numbers really and be like, okay, well, is this anti-feminine or pro-masculine, right? And the different groups allowed me to have that sort of multi-directional analysis, because there were some instances, say, where like being masculine was really advantageous, but being mostly masculine wasn't, right? There were some ones where being anonymous was the same as masculine, and it allowed me, because I was doing, I've forgotten the name of the test, but like post hoc analysis, I could then sort of delve in and rethink about the data. Because if I had these categories to start off with, it was a lot easier to then work down and think about comparisons where there might be more nuances, because I had such a big data set, right? It's a decade of questions and answers that then I could sort of unpick things a bit more. Trying to remember how I ended up with 5. I think it's because 3 felt like a binary and an other. And that was what I was really trying to avoid. Because if you're just tapping another category onto a binary that you already have, then you haven't really done anything, right? You've just given a label to the data you normally throw out. And so I wanted to add a bit more space there. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how has your research been in computational communities? Because sometimes it happens when you study gender and all the women in the research, or because like some people give the breath.
Yeah, it's definitely mixed. I have to say there's part of it as well where gender theorists don't like my quite practical approach to gender theory as well. Like it kind of goes both ways. There's a lot of my research that they hadn't liked, but one of the ways that I do it is I'd like to do, say, computational research, like the Stack Overflow, which, can I remember where that is published? Okay, the Stack Overflow paper is published in, which is a computational research design, is published in a socio-communications journal, right? I also recently published a ethnography in a data science conference. So it's in applied computing machinery, and it's called Incels, Virgins, and Nice Guys. And I'll tell you the pushback I got from reviewer comments of that. But my approach has always been to be direct as possible. So for example, when I submitted the Incels paper, because it's about sharing memes at hackathons and how this creates like a sense of bonding in temporary communities, because we have like this joke of like milady fedoras and all of that stuff. Honestly, sometimes defining some of those words in an internet context is a bit wild. But there I had to include a section that was about ethnography, but I refused to be like, actually ethnography is valid, right? Like I didn't want to come from that point. So it was then about, okay, well, the data science language is to go, well, this model is for this problem. So in this case, it was like, okay, well, it's about like nuances of discourse. Can you do that with an algorithm? Not really yet. So let's do it with ethnography. Like it's the better tool for the job. And I also ended up directly quoting some of the reviewers' negative comments. And it was like, if you read it, there'll be a line in it which says something like, comparisons of ethnography to journalistic opinionated writing are misguided. And it was just like really aggressive, because if they hold that point of view and they've been really aggressive in my comments, right, then I need to tell them exactly why that's wrong. Partly because those reviewers are the people that will be reading it. So I don't want to be like subtle into why this stuff matters, but I want them to be very clear as to why it's not opinionated journalistic writing. And ultimately, you have faith in a researcher to conduct an ethnography in the same way that you have faith that someone wrote their algorithm properly, right? And they didn't just like make it up at some point. Like there's a lot of behind the scenes trust in the process that spans, and there's ultimately a lot more in common with these two places than we like to think. Because if you think about anything that you've ever studied or wanted to look at more academically, it's generally stuff that you found interesting, right? And by the sheer fact of being interested in it, you have a bit of an opinion on it. And so I think that like there's a lot more permeability between the two, but I sort of negotiate it by being quite aggressive against criticism, and also just having like slightly silly titles that show that I do know what I'm on about. Like it's a list of terms that are associated with internet culture. But I think the biggest thing is just to not be apologetic. It's like, I do this research design because of these priorities that you've said are important. I don't do this research design because I can't code. And there's also this idea that once you do learn data science, you stop doing qualitative research, you stop asking people how they feel. And data scientists are really like against this, but yet they can't make sentiment analysis work properly, right? Like, so there's an element like this, when we have both of these sorts of expertise, can we really be able to like make algorithms do something a bit more fun? Because then there's this difference, right? We're not just taking something that someone's already built and pushing it over there. So yes, but I think being in the middle is far more interesting. Yeah.
You mentioned that like one of the issues is that people kind of, if you would tell them it's music about sexism or about gender studies, like obviously they're gonna like self-censor their answers. And then I guess like one way obviously is the way you describe that, make it seem like it's about something else and people will not have the same kind of self-censorship. Is there any other recommendations that you found that good to employ for that very particular problem, or something you tried that absolutely didn't work?
So I didn't want to. It was more. So I think there's definitely an element in like research ethics towards like completely lying and just like a slight misdirection. I wrote when I'm doing the project that it was about testing the features of a new freelancing platform, which is correct. I just didn't use the word discrimination, right? And it's just like, but then if you go on some of the participant information, so but I hate PowerPoint, it's so slow. Okay, yeah. So in the top right here, they have like participant information. So like the information is available. It is, if they clicked on that, they would get all of the information sheet for the entire study, but then talks about the overarching purpose of the experiment. And so like it's there, but I didn't want, like, it's about making best use of people's time as well. And because it's a study on discrimination, I also made sure I was paying people a reasonable amount, right? Like, so there's other things like that, like, you can't study discrimination and then pay people sub minimum wage. Like, it'd be a bit ridiculous, but it's quite often done. I think researchers quite often spend a lot more time going, how can I build this pretty platform? How can I learn how to use a random forest? How can I do deep learning? And they don't necessarily think, well, why am I doing it? And is that even necessary to do it that way? So say with this, there's been some research done on freelancing and discrimination, but it's done through APIs, right? Which is only giving you a description of inequality as it currently exists and then theorizing what might make a difference. My work is oriented always towards what practical recommendations can I give? What can I tell people to do? And not just put it in the conclusion, what can I bring to them to do? So that is always something that will inform how I design the project to start off with, is how can I bring this to stakeholders and go, I've found a way, or this doesn't work, or what can I do to do it? And that will change it. Like, I guess in research design, it's a lot more about ecological validity, i.e. how does the thing within your study relate to the real world? And so that for me is quite important. It is very simplistic, but there's other things that I put in this study that were quite interesting. Like, I fully believe that in any study you're doing where you're asking people to do a task, put a free text box at the ends that just generally asks for their opinion, but don't make it like mandatory or anything, because you can get some really interesting information there. Like, I was looking at some ones when they'd filled it out and they were talking just like very blatantly about how, well, they only hire people with like fluent English. And then you then look at the nationality as they reported, and like, therefore, I think this person was based in like Bangladesh, and you're like, okay, so you have this prejudice that you're very clear about, but it's like this offset thing that doesn't support what is said in the literature as well. And so you get, rather than just having to infer causality through numbers, you can actually get a little bit of what they think as well. And if anything, it gives you like a nice word cloud to put at some point in a presentation, right? So my succinct answer would be design research as people experience it, because you will struggle to make points on the relevance or that these things need to be done for it if it appears to be so much in a vacuum that it doesn't have any real world importance. However, there's also this thing in politics, right, where it's like everyone on Twitter is not everyone. So it's also being aware of the limitations of the people that you're also speaking to. So with this, because it's funded by the British Academy, it has to be all people from Britain, and all the people on it also have to be Britain, right? Which is why it says location United Kingdom on it. And it also says it on the job advert as well, right? So then there's little bits like that that I have to compromise because I want people to fund my research, but ideally it would have been a lot broader. I'd have also done something with names in terms of how people infer ethnicity through names. So like, does it really make a difference? Because the freelancers in the interview said it really did. Like, if they use like a very sort of like English British sounding name. The other thing that isn't in these slides that I did in the study is I included like a freelancer company. So this sort of linked to some of my Stack Overflow stuff, where I have like a picture of like a logo, like something that was just like some geometric shapes, and then it would just be like _freelancer, right? And so then it has that in there as well to then look at that anonymity. So I think my research is generally led by this similarity in themes, but like when I start talking, it goes all over the place. All questions? As I said, I teach computer programming and research design at LSE to the masters there. So please do reach out to me. My website has all of my information on it. I also have my email address, and I'm pretty responsive, and I love talking about people's work with them. So yeah, if you have any questions, or you just want to, or if you're interested in some of the literature I really like skipped over badly, then yeah, like just drop me an email. I like being open. But yeah, thank you, everyone.